Part 1 .NET Core plus GraphQL using Hotchocolate version 11. Let's create an empty .NET Core API project. After creating the empty project, let's open the folder. Once you've opened the folder, let's open the terminal of the Visual Studio Code, and then let's proceed to add the entity framework packages. First, the EF Core package. And then next is the EF Core and SQL Server configuration package. After that, the tools. And then the proxies to enable the lazy loading. After the entity framework, let's proceed to add the Hotchocolate packages. Okay, so once we have installed the EF Core and the Hotchocolate packages, let's set up now the models for our code first approach. We'll be creating first our DB context. Let's call this AppDB. Let's set up the constructor configuration. Okay, so we have created now our DB context. Next is our DB set, or the actual database model via code first. Let's create a task with a field of ID and name. And then next is, let's create another one. Let's call this task priority. With a field of ID and name also. Okay, then after that, let's try to connect the task to task priority. We'll be adding a navigation property. First with the foreign key task priority ID. Okay, virtual. Then the foreign key setup. That will be task priority ID. Now let's add the recently created as dbset task, and then the task priority. Now let's seed our data so that we can already have a initial data that we will use on once we do the querying. So the model builder, let's seed first the task priorities. Let's set this up as first low priority. Okay, let's copy that one, paste it to create the second and third. We'll rename the second as medium and the last one is high. Okay, next we'll be going to seed the data for the task. Okay, with the model builder again, entity, task. Let's call this one go to grocery. Then let's set the task priority ID to 2, which is medium. Okay, let's create another one. 2 name, and this one let's say cook dinner. And task priority ID, let's set this one to 3 as high priority. Okay, then save that. Check on the error, missing semicolon. Okay, no error. Now let's set up the configuration. We will need to register our DB context. At first we need to set up the configuration. Set up the startup constructor and the configuration. Use the configuration. Okay, and after that proceed now to register the DB context. Services that add DB context, and then the DB context name appdb. And let's set up the options. Option 1 is to enable the lazy loading. So we'll be using the use lazy loading proxies, and then the use SQL server. Then let's use the configuration, then get connection string. Yeah. Let's create the connection string local DB. So now let's proceed to create the local DB connection string in the app settings of JSON. Okay, connection strings. The name will be local DB. Let me copy my connection string. Server. The connection string will be depends on your connection string. Currently, this is my setup. I'm just using my local DB. Server MSI. Database will be the name of the database that will be created. For this one, I'm going to name the DB GraphQL demo DB. Then trusted connection calls true. Okay, let's save that one. Okay, let's create the migration. We'll call the migration initial create. Okay, let's check the migration data. Seems good. Insert data, insert data. Then need to update the database. Okay, no error. Now, since we have set up our database, let's proceed to set up our GraphQL server. First, we need to create our query. Let's call this query task query. Then set up an iQueryable task. Let's name this get all. We're using the setup used by the Hotchocolate version 11. So using the scope service appdb. Then return db task. Okay. Let's add the namespace required. Hotchocolate. Let's add the use DB context using the hotchocolate.data. Okay. After we create the get all, let's create another one. Return a single task. Let's call this get by ID. Same as get all, we need to copy the scope service. Then let's add the parameter int ID. And then our query will be find and then use the ID parameter. Okay. Same with the get all, we need to use the useDB context as well. Okay. After we created the query, we need to modify our active the DB contact registration so that we will be able to the concurrent requests. We'll be using the add pool DB context factory by Hotchocolate as well. Okay, then we need to set up now our GraphQL server. services. Let's register our GraphQL server. Let's add a query type, the task query. Okay, seems good. Okay, let's update our endpoints and use the GraphQL endpoints. So let's register endpoints and then that map GraphQL. Okay. Let's add another configuration so that we will be able to display additional error data in case there is an error with our GraphQL queries. Let's set up the web host environment on the constructor of the startup, env, and then let's update our GraphQL server configuration. Let's add the modify request option. These options will display additional error data instead of a generic data for us to include exception details. Let's say for the development. Okay, let's fix the error. Then seems good. Next also is we need to add the add projections on the version 11 of Hotchocolate. This fixes the error when we are using a lazy loaded properties. Let's say for example like the task. It has a navigation property of task priorities. Okay. Since our GraphQL server is set up now, let's try to run the application using the .NET Watch Run. Okay, and then let's copy the localhost and then localhost 5000. Then navigate to your browser via localhost 5000/GraphQL. You can see now the task query by all and get by ID. Let's set up a simple query. Let's use the all. And let's set up the fields that we want to retrieve. For this one, we need the ID, name, task priority, ID, and name also. Let's set up the request to be first request. Let's test the query for now. Let's see if it's working. Alright, seems working. We are able to retrieve our data coming from the database to go to grocery and the cook dinner. Okay, and then let's add a second request using the all as well, but with different return fields. Say the second request, name and ID only for the task priority. Okay, so it's working as well. for now the second request. But we add the by ID. It has an argument of ID, which means that we need to pass an ID for the payload. So get by ID, then set up ID colon, and then let's say we want to return the cooked dinner. Let's use the ID number 2. Then let's set up the field that we want to return, ID and task priority, then name. Okay, let's try the request. Okay, all requests seems working and no error. So seems our query setup is complete. For our part 2, we'll be creating the mutations for our GraphQL. So kindly stay tuned.